Well, good morning, friends. Mark Milwee, Trinity, Alabama, Mountain View Baptist Church. We want to continue our journey through the Bible today with a lesson I've entitled Be of Good Cheer. It's from actually starts with the last verse of Acts chapter 22. So if you want to grab your Bible, that's where we're going to be picking up there today. And through our text today, we're going to discover that we should always be of good cheer because God is near. Be of good cheer because God is near. We find this in the key verse that I'd like to begin with today. It's found in chapter 23, verse 11. So Acts chapter 23, verse 11, and this is what it says. It says, "The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, 'Take courage, for as I have testified, excuse me, for as you have testified to me about testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome.'" So the Lord's message to Paul in this passage in many translations begins with, "Be of good cheer." Other translations say things like, "Be brave, take courage, have courage, be encouraged, don't worry, take heart, be glad." One even says, "Cheer up." So we all face hard and difficult times in life, and Paul is in the middle of one in our text this morning, and the Lord is reminding Paul, just like he is reminding us, that we never face a struggle in life, we never face a hard time, a difficulty, a trial, that he is not right there beside us. Oftentimes when people are going through hard times and they come and talk with me or call me, I'll encourage them with Proverbs 3, 5, and 6. It says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will direct your paths." And it's a great passage. It's a good reminder, especially if we're going through a hard time. But I came upon another passage as I was preparing this message this week, and it's found in Psalm 34, verse 7. Listen to what it says. It says, "The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them." We're going to see this verse play out numerous times in our text today. So let's jump in and see what we can learn. You might recall when we finished up last time, the Romans had just stretched Paul out on the whipping post, and they are about to flog him when he asked a simple question. He asked, "Is it lawful for you to flog a man who is a Roman citizen and is uncondemned?" Well, of course, the answer is no. And as it turned out, Paul was more of a legitimate citizen than the commander was. Paul was born a citizen, but the commander had to pay a large sum of money for his citizenship. Therefore, they quickly abandoned that plan. But the commander still had to get to the bottom of the situation. So he comes up with plan B, which is to take Paul before the Sanhedrin. The Jewish Sanhedrin was kind of like a Jewish Supreme Court. It was composed of 70 of the most distinguished religious leaders in the country. They were responsible for interpreting and applying the Jewish law to the affairs of the nation. They were also responsible for passing judgment on anyone who violated these laws. So look now at the very last verse of chapter 22. It says, "But on the next day, desiring to know the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews, he unbound him and commanded the chief priests and all the council to meet, and he brought Paul down and set him before them." So the irony is that the commander had arrested a man and he didn't really even know why. He assumed that Paul must be guilty of some heinous act. Otherwise, the Jewish people would not have been trying to kill him. So the text says he brought him down before the Sanhedrin to find out the real reason why he was being accused by the Jews. Well, unfortunately, we're going to see in a moment this didn't work either, but it illustrates the first truth that I want to share with you today, and it's this: God is with us when we face our enemies. God is with us when we face our enemies. The verse we shared just a moment ago, "The angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them." We clearly see this in this situation. Look at verse 1 now, chapter 23. "And looking intently at the council, Paul said, 'Brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day.'" So Paul begins by addressing them as brothers. And we know from his testimony last week that he grew up at the feet of Gamaliel, one of the most eminent rabbis of his day. We also know from earlier in Acts that Gamaliel was a member of the Sanhedrin. Therefore, we have every reason to believe that Paul was also a member of this group, since we read in Galatians last time that he was excelling in Judaism more than all of his peers. If not a member, he was their number one prospect as he led the way in persecuting and hunting down the Christians. In other words, he was no stranger to this group. Everyone knew who he was, and therefore he addresses them as brothers. But then he continues by saying, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day. Now, we're going to talk more about what he says here about his conscience next week, because he also says this in chapter 24. Therefore, I'm going to save most of that for next time. However, some Bible scholars just can't believe that Paul said this when we look back at all the things that he had done in his life, like persecuting the Christians and being present at the martyrdom of Stephen, the first Christian martyr. Paul would argue that he did those things in good conscience because he was doing what he thought God wanted him to do at the time. But we're going to talk about that next week. But Bible scholars were not the only ones to take issue with what he says here. He also upset the high priest. Look at verse 2. And the high priest Ananias commanded those who stood by him to strike him on the mouth. Well, Ananias was upset for different reasons. John Stott in his commentary says the most likely explanation for this reaction is that Ananias understood Paul's words as a claim that though now a Christian, he was still a good Jew, having served God with a good conscience all of his life. Therefore, Ananias instructed those standing by to strike Paul across the mouth. And the Lord told us to turn the other cheek. The Lord also fulfilled the prophecies that said, like a lamb before its shears is silent. But Paul, he just was not able to do this. I mean, look at how the text continues. Then Paul said to him, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law? Yet contrary to the law, you order me to be struck. Paul let his anger get the best of him here. He basically is calling the high priest a hypocrite. And he said, you can't sit and judge me by the law when you are acting contrary to the law. And you got to remember, Paul was no novice when it came to the law. I mean, he knew the law thoroughly, and he was probably thinking of a passage like Leviticus 19:15 that says, you shall do no injustice in court. At any rate, this is what he said. And he received an immediate response. Those who stood by said, would you revile God's high priest? And Paul said, I did not know, brothers, that he was a high priest, for it is written, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. So again, Paul shows his vast knowledge of the law by quickly recalling from memory Exodus 22:28, you shall not speak evil of a ruler of your people. But did Paul really not know that this was the high priest? You wouldn't believe some of the gymnastics some of the commentaries go to trying to defend Paul here. Some say, well, he couldn't see very well. Others say he didn't really know, who gave the order. Somebody else said, well, maybe Ananias was not wearing his official robes, and that's why Paul didn't know who it was. I think and believe Paul lost his temper. He lost his temper. He insulted the high priest, and then he said, I didn't know he was the high priest, meaning I didn't think a high priest would act like that. Well, however he meant it, he quickly understood he was not going to get a fair trial before this man. So he does something that's very ingenious. He makes a statement that takes the spotlight off of him and places it on an issue that he knows is very divisive among the members of the Sanhedrin. So look at the text again, beginning in verse 6. Now, when Paul perceived that one part were Sadducees and the other Pharisees, he cried out in the council, brothers, I am a Pharisee and a son of Pharisees. It is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. And when he had said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees. And the assembly was divided, for the Sadducees say there is no resurrection, nor angels, nor spirits, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. You see, Paul was such an intelligent man. He knew exactly what to say at just the right time to get a reaction. This passage is basically self-explanatory. Paul is clearly a Pharisee. and he says he is on trial because of his belief in the resurrection of the dead. And this caused a dispute because the Pharisees believed in the spiritual world and everything that went with it, but the Sadducees did not. And so as a result of this statement, a heated debate breaks out. Look at verse 9. Then a great clamor arose, and some of the scribes of the Pharisees' party stood up and contended sharply, "We find nothing wrong in this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him?" And when the dissension became violent, the tribune, afraid that Paul would be torn to pieces by them, commanded the soldiers to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. So now for the third time, the soldiers have to rescue Paul. They rescued him the first time just outside the temple when the vicious mob was trying to beat him to death. They rescued him the second time following his message on the steps of the Antonia Fortress when he mentioned that God had sent him to the Gentiles, and the crowd just erupted in violence, and so they had to do it again. And now the distinguished leaders of the nation became so violent that the soldiers had to rush in again to save Paul. Well, one thing we can say about Paul is he sure knew how to stir up a crowd. But once again, God was with him. God gave him the right words to say at just the right time. And in fact, many scholars believe that if this dispute had not have erupted, they would have condemned Paul to death. We're going to see in just a moment how much they hated him. But God had other plans for Paul. And so this brings us to the second truth I want to share with you this morning. God is with us when we are down and discouraged. God is with us when we are down and discouraged. Look at verse 11. The following night, the Lord stood by him and said, "Take courage, for as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome." Now, you know, if you think about it, Paul must have been very discouraged following this turn of events in the Sanhedrin. He had returned to Jerusalem following his third missionary journey with high hopes of reaching his countrymen with the gospel. The church leaders, they had listened intently as he related all the challenges that he had faced in taking the gospel to the Gentiles. However, instead of celebrating his accomplishments, they were more worried about their Jewish rituals and practices. They wanted him to go to the temple and go through this process of purification. He reluctantly agreed to do so, but instead of appeasing the Jewish people, he was forcefully removed from the temple and almost killed. Well, undaunted by that, he shared his testimony with the crowds on the steps there of the fortress, and I'm sure that he was hoping for a positive response. And things were going along well until he mentioned that God had sent him to the Gentiles, and then pandemonium broke out. And so now today he has this opportunity to stand before this distinguished body that I'm sure that he aspired and longed to be a part of as a young man growing up at the feet of Gamaliel. But once again, instead of things going well, this ended disastrously. I mean, he probably felt like a royal failure. And my guess is that when he lay down to go to bed that night, that he was a very tired, weary, and discouraged man. So let me ask you a question. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever found yourself in Paul's shoes? Have you ever done everything you thought that the Lord wanted you to do, and instead of success, you were met with one failure after another? Have you ever tried so hard, but instead of receiving fruit for your labor, it feels like your fruit basket is empty and bare? Well, I've certainly been there, and if you serve the Lord long enough, you'll find yourself there too. The Christian life is a long journey filled with many peaks and valleys. But I want to remind you again that you never are walking this road alone. In the middle of this dark night, the scripture says that the Lord appeared to Paul, and the Lord has said to him, "Be of good cheer." In other words, as the other translations all said, be brave, take courage, have courage, be encouraged, don't worry, take heart, be glad. Cheer up, Paul. Paul thought he was a failure, but God thought otherwise. Look at what the verse goes on to say, "For as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome." Paul thought he had not accomplished very much in Jerusalem. But the Lord said, "Just as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem." Listen, Paul was used mightily by God because Paul was faithful to do what God asked him to do. God has never called anybody to be successful. He's called us to be faithful. And listen, Paul was successful in the Lord's eyes because he was faithful to do what the Lord asked him to do. Paul couldn't see any visible fruit from his time in Jerusalem. But we'll never know until we get to heaven how God used those seeds that Paul planted while he was there. Well, we know, looking back, from the eyes of history, that Paul was one of the most successful missionaries that ever lived. He crammed more into one lifetime than many could ever accomplish in multiple lifetimes. He was very instrumental in getting Christianity up and off the ground and moving in the right direction. Very few, if any, have impacted the world for the cause of Christ more than Paul. But he couldn't see it on this night. He still needed to hear that still small voice from God to remind him that he was with him and that he was watching over him and that he was going to continue to be with him. And this is exactly what the Lord did for him. What an encouragement these words must have been to Paul. I am certain that he held on to these words for the rest of his life. And if you stop and think about it, this was not the first time that the Lord had spoken to Paul. He spoke to him first on the Damascus Road when he was dramatically saved. He told us in his testimony last week that following his conversion, he returned to Jerusalem. He's praying in the temple. And the Lord told him that he needed to leave because they were not going to listen to him and his testimony in Jerusalem. On the second missionary journey, when he got to a point where he didn't know what to do, the Lord told him to go into Macedonia. Later on in Corinth, the Lord appeared to him. At another time when he was down and discouraged and told him to keep on preaching and teaching, that he was watching over him and that he was going to protect him. And he ended up staying 2 years in that city. And now he tells him, just like I've been with you in Jerusalem, I'm going to be with you in Rome. And even on his way to Rome in chapter 27, we haven't gotten there yet, but when we do, we're going to see that he is on a ship that's lost at sea. And the Lord appears to him and tells him that he must appear before Caesar, and that not only he's going to survive, but everybody on the ship is also going to be spared. So God had a way of showing up at just the right time in Paul's life and giving him the strength and encouragement that he needed to keep on pressing forward. And listen, he'll do the exact same thing for you if you'll trust him. I don't know what trial or difficulty or struggle or discouragement or disappointment you might be facing right now, but I want to remind you of these words of the psalmist when he says, the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear him and delivers them. He delivered Paul, and he'll do the same for you. And this brings us then to the third truth I want to share with you today, is that God is with us when others try to hurt us. God is with us when others try to hurt us. Let me do that. Okay. Verse 13. When it was day, the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. There was more than 40 who made this conspiracy. They went to the chief priests and the elders and said, we have strictly bound ourselves by an oath to taste no food till we have killed Paul. Now therefore you, along with the council, give notice to the tribune to bring him down to you, as though you were going to determine his case more exactly, and we are ready to kill him before he comes near. This passage illustrates the hatred that these men had for Paul. They hated him so much that 40 of them took an oath not to eat or drink until they wiped him off of the face of the earth. And they thought they had a foolproof plan. But they didn't realize who they were dealing with. And I'm not talking about Paul, I'm talking about God. Look at verse 16. Now the son of Paul's sister heard of their ambush, so he went and entered the barracks and told Paul. Paul called one of the centurions and said, take this young man to the tribune, for he has something to tell him. So he took him and brought him to the tribune and said, Paul the prisoner called me and asked me to bring this young man to you. He has something to say to you. The tribune took him by the hand going aside, asking privately, what is it that you have to tell me? And he said, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down to the council tomorrow, as though they're going to inquire something more closely about him. But do not be persuaded by them, for more than 40 of the men are lying in ambush for him, who have bound themselves by an oath, neither to eat nor drink, till they have killed him. And now they're ready, waiting for your consent. So the tribune dismissed the young man, charging him, tell no one that you have informed me of these things. Now, this is the first and only place in the New Testament where we are told that Paul had any relatives living in Jerusalem. We don't know where this nephew came from. We don't know who Paul's sister is. We don't know how they heard this information. We don't know how the nephew got in to see Paul. We don't know why he was allowed to go and share this information with the tribune. I mean, think about it. A prisoner once, said for me to send this guy to you, so he could tell you this. I mean, how many times would that work out? I mean, there are so many things that we do not know. But we do know that God had placed him in just the right place at just the right time to save Paul's life. This reminds us that, listen, God is always working behind the scenes in ways that we cannot see. Maybe you've heard that popular Christian song, Waymaker. I think it was written by Michael W. Smith. But it says, Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. My God, that is who you are. Waymaker, miracle worker, promise keeper, light in the darkness. That is who you are. It says that several times, but then it gets to the chorus, and the chorus says, even when I can't see it, you're working. Even when I can't feel it, you're working. You never stop working. You never stop working. As the psalmist said, the angel of the Lord is encamped around those who fear him and delivers them. Listen, God was working behind the scenes to deliver Paul, and God is working behind the scenes right now to deliver you from whatever trouble and difficulty and hardship that you're facing. So let's finish up and see how Paul was delivered. Then he called two of the centurions and said, get ready 200 soldiers with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at the third hour of the night. Also provide mounts for Paul to ride and bring him safely to Felix the governor. And he wrote a letter to this effect. Claudius Lysias, to his excellency the governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. And desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down before their council. I found that he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. And when it was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you the charges they had against him. And so the soldiers, according to their instructions, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipas. And on the next day, they returned to the barracks, letting the horsemen go on with him. And when they had come to Caesarea, delivered the letter to the governor, they presented Paul to him also. And on reading the letter, he asked what province he was from. And when he learned that he was from Cilicia, he said, I will give you a hearing when your accusers arrive. And he commanded him to be guarded in Herod's praetorium. So listen, look. God provided 470 soldiers to lead Paul safely out of Jerusalem. I mean, that would have been over or almost half the men in the garrison. And so they safely delivered Paul to the governor, where he was housed in a palace on the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. That's what Herod's praetorium was. And, well, we're going to discover he ended up staying there 2 years. He rescued Paul from those who were trying to harm him. And again, he'll do the same for you. I want to close today with a summary statement that I found in one of my commentaries that I felt like was so encouraging. And so I want you to listen carefully to what this Bible scholar says. He writes, I cannot tell you what God is doing in your circumstance. I cannot see the future any more than you can. But God is doing something in your circumstances. And if you're going through dark times as Paul was, if you're discouraged, if the way seems dark, if you're weary with the struggle, the message of this chapter is to continue to trust God and serve Him regardless. His purposes for you will be accomplished, the day will brighten, and the will of God will be done. All because, listen carefully, friends, the angel of the Lord encamps around those who fear Him and delivers them. He's going to deliver you. You just got to trust Him. Well, amen. Thank you for watching today. God bless you.